While one of the most popular pastimes, model railways can be some of the most useful tools for larger scale railways. Models can be used to showcase prototypes, they can be used to troubleshoot problems, or in some cases, models, like in the case of William Pearson, can be vital evidence. The 17th of January 1901 was to most a cold grey day. For Rhoda King, the day was greyer than most. One of her relatives was sick. The relative lived in London, so Rhoda had to take the 11:20 train from Southampton to Waterloo. When the London and South Western train pulled in, Rhoda spied the empty third-class compartment and entered. The journey would take just under 2 hours, so she got comfortable and started to watch the world go by as the train sped away from busy towns to rolling hills. The compartment wasn't exactly spacious and lacked the new corridor that many other carriages were beginning to sport, but unusually, it did have a connecting toilet. The toilets were a brand new feature and were a blessing, especially on longer journeys. It helped the train companies too. There had been too many close calls, so to speak, as passengers would pop off the train to spend a penny, only to race back as the train was getting ready to depart, or worse, pulling off, causing passengers trying to open doors on a moving carriage. The only downside was that the toilet was almost too close to the compartment, meaning that any unsavoury smells would filter through, and there was no escaping who was responsible. The start of the journey was simple enough, and the third-class carriage remained unoccupied, save for Rhoda. At Eastleigh, this changed as a gentleman boarded and settled across from her. The man in question was George Parker. He was young, only 23. However, his story was complicated. He had promised as a soldier, but was discharged by the army. Faced with no other options, he turned to drink, and would steal money to fuel his habit. His petty exploits were known to the police, but he was down to his last few pence. He was desperate to get to London, but his ticket was only paid to Winchester. This meant that once the train passed the station, he would be caught by one of the many platform staff who would fine him once it was established he had the incorrect fare. Although we know through testimony that neither Rhoda or George ever spoke, it's not impossible to imagine the pair exchanging glances, Rhoda in politeness, but George, given his situation, had something more sinister on his mind. At Winchester, the train stopped and the compartment door opened to William Pearson. William was a wealthy farmer. He was local to the town and well respected. He needed to travel to London to conduct some business and boarded the carriage. The other two occupants looked up but said nothing. When the train left the town and was up to speed, all was calm in the compartment. Rhoda was taking in the scenery while William had fallen asleep. George took the opportunity to excuse himself and enter the lavatory. When he came out, he positioned himself opposite the sleeping gent and raised a pistol. 2 loud bangs echoed around the compartment. Rhoda at first thought they may be misplaced detonators, if it wasn't for the trickle of blood falling down her cheek. William slumped in the seat, gargling for breath, while George searched the old man's pockets for money. Rhoda then found her voice. "My God, what have you done?" she screamed. But George was honest. "For money," he replied. "You got any?" Realising the danger she was now in, Rhoda did the only thing she could. She looked through her purse and found a shilling. She handed it to him with a plea to cover the dead man's face. Funny enough, George complied, and used a handkerchief to give the dead man some dignity. But Rhoda knew she was still trapped on a speeding train with no way out and a gun-wielding madman, so she pleaded for her life. George was more focused, however, on the weapon, so Rhoda focused on it as well. "You better toss it," she said. George hesitated, but eventually complied, throwing it out the window. As the train made its way to Vauxhall Station, George opened the door and stepped onto the carriage's running board. It might seem absurd, but it wasn't an uncommon, if not dangerous, thing to do. Before jumping off, he looked back and threatened Rhoda not to say a word as the train stopped. He jumped off and started to disappear in the crowd. Rhoda knew George couldn't get away with it, and when the train stopped, she shouted and pointed to him, crying, "Stop that man! He has killed someone!" 5 men quickly gave chase as George pushed past the staff and ran from the station, desperate to get lost in the winding streets. More and more people joined the chase to shout, and he found himself in the gasworks. He tried to escape, but with the sheer number of people he was cornered and quickly arrested, cursing leaving the woman alive. Back at the railway station, William was taken to St Thomas's Hospital. However, it was clear he was beyond help, and he was pronounced dead later that day. The carriage was now a crime scene, and it was searched for any clues. Thanks to the excellent testimony, the police quickly recovered the revolver from the tracks, and photos were taken of the scene. The evidence wasn't just at the station. Because of the quick arrest, George had plenty of evidence in his pockets, including many items belonging to William. George faced Mr Justice Fillimore at the Old Bailey on the 1st of March, and under the advice of his lawyer he pleaded not guilty on the account of his alcoholism. This meant for those involved, evidence was required. While Mrs King's testimony was vital to help set up the scene, the police approached the carriage workshop of the London and South Western Railway. They knew that it would be difficult to bring the court and the jury to the scene of the crime, especially now the carriage was back in service. So the police asked the carriage works to build a model replica using drawings they had and their knowledge. The carriage works produced a 2-scale perfect reproduction. The 1-in-6 model was incredibly detailed and was made using offcuts from the shop floor. There were luggage racks, working doors and windows. Even the toilet had a little miniature towel left from the offcuts. The seats were even upholstered using the actual cloth from the carriages themselves. One feature it did show was the communication cord. The communication cord had been around for many decades. However, on this particular carriage, it ran on the outside of the door, meaning that you would have to lean out to use it. It explained why Rhoda couldn't use it when William was shot, as it was simply out of her reach. Considering the model had taken less than 3 months to build, no detail was spared, and using it brought an extra element to the testimony. It didn't take long for the jury to come back with a verdict, guilty, and there was only one punishment. Justice was swift for George Parker. On the 19th of March, he was taken from his cell at Wandsworth Prison to the gallows, and under the expert gaze of James Billington, he faced his fate. The model from the trial was simply too intricate to dismantle and ended up in store before it was acquired by the Railway Museum. It is still in the store in the North Shed and can be admired today. Digital imagery, rendering and 3D technology generally makes the use of physical models in courts less common, but the replica carriage is a rare complete example, and if you see it in the museum today, it's easy to imagine Rhoda King sitting there minding her own business and William deep asleep in those few tranquil moments before George changed everything for a few simple pennies.